Chapter 1. The First Crack. Martin Hamilton had always believed that being a forensic psychologist meant he'd seen the worst of humanity. 20 years of analyzing crime scenes, interviewing murderers, and testifying in court had built walls around his heart thick enough to withstand almost anything. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared him for the moment Dr. Ricardo Goodman froze while examining his daughter's ultrasound. "Martin, you need to look at this," his wife Charlotte Hamilton whispered, her voice cracking in a way he'd never heard before. They'd been married for 8 years, and Charlotte was unshakable, an ICU nurse who'd held dying patients' hands and delivered impossible news to families. But now her face was chalk white. 6-year-old Emma Hamilton sat on the examination table, her small legs dangling over the edge, completely oblivious to the tension filling the room. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hoppers, and hummed the theme song from her favorite cartoon. Her auburn hair, inherited from Charlotte, was tied in 2 lopsided pigtails she'd insisted on doing herself that morning. "My tummy feels better now," Emma announced cheerfully. "Can we get ice cream?" Dr. Goodman's hand trembled slightly as he moved the ultrasound wand. His 30 years of pediatric medicine had etched permanent smile lines around his eyes, but they weren't visible now. "Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton, I need you to step outside with me for a moment." Martin's training kicked in immediately. He cataloged every micro-expression on Goodman's face, the tightness around the jaw, the slight dilation of pupils, the way his free hand gripped the edge of the examination table. Whatever was on that screen wasn't a routine stomach bug. "Emma, sweetie, can you wait here with Nurse Teresa?" Charlotte's voice was steady, but Martin caught the tremor in her hand as she squeezed their daughter's shoulder. Teresa Jackson, a veteran pediatric nurse with kind eyes and graying hair, immediately stepped in. "How about we find some stickers for Mr. Hoppers while your parents talk to the doctor?" In the hallway, Dr. Goodman pulled up the images on his tablet, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There's significant internal scarring in the intestinal wall. The pattern is concerning. This isn't from any illness or natural cause I've ever seen." "What are you saying?" Martin's mind was already racing through possibilities, cataloging, analyzing. "The scarring suggests repeated trauma over several weeks, possibly months. Small but deliberate." Goodman's professional mask slipped for just a moment. "In my 30 years, I've only seen patterns like this in cases where," he stopped, looked at both of them, "where someone has been deliberately harming a child." The hallway tilted. Martin gripped the wall, his forensic training warring with his instinct as a father. Charlotte made a sound like she'd been punched. "Poisoning." Martin's voice was flat, clinical, the only way he could keep functioning. "Possibly. Or introducing foreign substances. I've already called Detective Israel Jones. He's with the Special Victims Unit and will meet us here within the hour." Goodman placed a hand on Martin's shoulder. "I'm legally obligated to report this. But even if I wasn't, Martin, someone has been hurting Emma." The next 2 hours blurred into a nightmare of clinical questions and gentle interrogations. Detective Jones was a tall black man in his mid-40s with sharp eyes and a deceptively gentle manner that Martin recognized immediately. He'd worked with enough cops to know when someone was very, very good at their job. "Emma." Jones knelt down to her eye level in the private room they'd been moved to. "Can you tell me about your tummy hurts? When did they start?" Emma scrunched her nose, thinking hard. "Maybe after my birthday? Uncle Don gives me special juice boxes that taste funny. But he says they'll make me strong like superheroes." Martin's blood turned to ice. Don Horton, Charlotte's younger brother. The man who'd crashed on their couch for 3 months, who Emma adored, who Martin had welcomed into their home despite his history of petty theft and drug problems because Charlotte had begged him to give her brother another chance. Charlotte's hand flew to her mouth. No, Martin, Don wouldn't. What else does Uncle Don give you, sweetheart?" Jones kept his voice gentle, but Martin saw the sharpness in his eyes. "Sometimes cookies with medicine in them. He says they're magic cookies that help me sleep really, really good." Emma yawned. "I get really sleepy after them. And sometimes my tummy hurts really bad, but Uncle Don says that means they're working." Martin stood up, so abruptly his chair fell backward. Every instinct screamed at him to find Don Horton and tear him apart with his bare hands. But Charlotte grabbed his arm, her nurse's training warring with her horror. "There has to be another explanation," she whispered, but even she didn't sound convinced. Jones stood, his expression grim. "Mr. Hamilton, I need you to step outside for a moment. Mrs. Hamilton, I'd like you to stay while we complete the examination. In the hallway, Martin pulled out his phone with shaking hands. He scrolled to the home security app he'd installed 6 months ago when they'd had a string of break-ins in the neighborhood. His forensic background had made him meticulous about documentation. He'd set cameras in the living room, kitchen, and Emma's playroom. Never the bedrooms or bathrooms, always conscious of privacy. He scrolled back through weeks of footage, his training helping him compartmentalize the rage building in his chest. There, 3 weeks ago, Don entering the kitchen at 2 a.m., removing something from his jacket, mixing it into a juice box. For days before that, 2 weeks before that, Martin's hands weren't shaking anymore. The red rage had crystallized into something cold and sharp and absolutely controlled. 20 years of analyzing criminal minds had taught him exactly how predators thought, how they operated, how they justified their actions. And now he knew exactly how to destroy one. Chapter 2. Beneath the Surface. Don Horton had disappeared by the time Detective Jones issued a warrant for his arrest. The apartment he'd moved into after leaving their house was empty except for a mattress on the floor and empty bottles of cheap vodka. But Martin had already known Don would run. Predators always did when they sensed the walls closing in. What Martin hadn't expected was what they found in Don's apartment: a laptop with encrypted files and a ledger with dates and amounts. Detective Jones's face had gone grave when he'd brought Martin into the station 3 days after Emma's diagnosis. "Martin, I need you to understand this is bigger than we initially thought," Jones said, sliding a folder across the desk. Don wasn't working alone, and Emma might not be his only victim. The folder contained surveillance photos, bank transfers, and chat logs that Jones's cyber team had cracked. Don had been part of an underground network, people who filmed and sold footage of children in distress. Not sexual abuse, which would have immediately triggered federal investigations, but something that existed in a gray area that made Martin's stomach turn. Pain entertainment for people with sadistic paraphilia. The small amounts of poison, never enough to cause permanent damage, always enough to cause visible suffering, had been carefully calibrated. The magic cookies contained sedatives mixed with substances that caused gastrointestinal distress. And Don had been documenting everything with hidden cameras, selling the footage to anonymous buyers. "We've identified at least 3 other children in the videos," Jones continued. "All neighbors or relatives of people in Don's network. The ringleader uses the handle Master Philip. We haven't identified him yet, but the IP address is traced back to somewhere in the city." Martin's clinical mask hadn't slipped once since that day in Dr. Goodman's office. Charlotte had broken down, cycled through denial and rage and guilt. But Martin had gone cold and quiet, his mind working through the problem like one of his forensic case studies. "You want me to consult?" Martin said. It wasn't a question. Jones leaned back. "Officially? No. You're personally involved, which means anything you discover might be inadmissible. Unofficially, you're one of the best forensic psychologists in the state. If you happen to develop a profile of this Master Philip character based on publicly available information, and that profile happened to point us in the right direction." Martin understood perfectly. Jones was giving him permission to hunt. That night, Charlotte was sedated and sleeping in their bedroom. Emma was staying with Charlotte's parents. Her grandfather, Randy Hayden, a retired firefighter, and her grandmother, Stephanie Ibarra Hayden, had sworn they'd protect Emma with their lives. Martin sat in his home office, the security footage playing on one screen while he typed notes on another. Don's psychology was simple enough. A narcissistic loser with delusions of grandeur, always jealous of his sister's stable life, eager to prove he was smarter than everyone else. He'd likely been recruited by someone who recognized his weaknesses and exploited them. But Master Philip, that was different. The chat logs revealed someone organized, intelligent, with significant resources. Someone who'd built an entire network and avoided detection for years. The language patterns suggested higher education, possibly medical or scientific background. The financial records showed sophisticated money laundering. Martin was so deep in analysis, he almost missed the notification on his phone. A message from an unknown number. "Stop looking, Mr. Hamilton. You're attracting the wrong kind of attention. Your daughter is alive. You want to keep it that way? Let the police handle it." Martin stared at the message for exactly 3 seconds before screenshotting it and forwarding it to Jones. Then he replied, I'm a forensic psychologist. Threats only tell me you're scared. And you should be. The response came immediately. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Martin smiled without humor. Funny. I was about to say the same thing to you. He powered down his phone and pulled out the burner he'd purchased that afternoon. 20 years in forensic psychology had taught him many things, including how to stay off the grid when necessary. He had work to do, and he couldn't afford surveillance. The first stop would be Morris Garza, a former client turned informant who ran in the darkest corners of the internet. If anyone could trace Master Philip's digital footprint, it was Morris. But as Martin grabbed his jacket, he spotted something that made him freeze. On the security footage from 3 months ago, right before Don moved in, there was a brief clip of Don having coffee with someone at their kitchen table while Martin and Charlotte were at work. The man's face was partially visible. Martin enhanced the image, his blood running cold as recognition hit. Philip Hyde, Charlotte's ex-boyfriend from nursing school. The man who'd refused to accept their breakup, who'd sent threatening messages until Martin had gotten a restraining order. The man Charlotte swore she hadn't seen in 5 years. Philip Hyde, Master Philip. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't random. This was revenge. Chapter 3, The Architect of Pain. Philip Hyde's history read like a textbook case of narcissistic personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies. Martin spent the next 48 hours excavating every detail of the man's life, piecing together a portrait that made his skin crawl. Hyde had been a nursing student with Charlotte 12 years ago, brilliant but volatile. According to old classmates Martin tracked down, Philip had been obsessed with Charlotte even then, following her between classes, showing up at her apartment unannounced, writing her increasingly disturbing love letters. When she'd started dating Martin instead, Philip had been expelled after allegedly tampering with a patient's medication during clinical rounds. The hospital had kept it quiet, but the rumors persisted. He told everyone Charlotte had destroyed his life. Allison Gill, a former classmate now working in Seattle, told Martin over a video call. Said she'd pay for choosing you. We all thought he was just a bitter ex, you know? But there was something in his eyes. She shuddered. I'm not surprised he never got over it. After his expulsion, Philip had vanished from legitimate medicine. Martin found traces of him working as a medical consultant for pharmaceutical companies, always briefly, always ending under mysterious circumstances. Then, 5 years ago, he'd gone completely off the grid, until Morris Garza cracked the encryption on Master Philip's files. Jesus Christ, Hamilton, Morris whispered over their encrypted call. The former hacker had promised to go straight after Martin had testified on his behalf at his trial, convincing the judge that Morris's skills could be better used helping law enforcement. This guy, he's not just distributing content. He's been running experiments, documenting the effects of different substances on children, measuring pain responses, keeping detailed medical records. Send me everything. Martin, you need to bring this to the feds. This is way beyond. Send me everything. The files Morris transmitted were damning. Philip had created a sophisticated operation with at least 8 active participants across 3 states. Don Horton had been the lowest level, a recruiter who provided access to vulnerable children in exchange for money and drugs. But Philip was the architect, the one who designed the protocols and analyzed the results. And Emma hadn't been a random target. She'd been specifically chosen. Philip's notes made that clear. Subject EH, daughter of CL and MH Poetic Justice. 6 years old, the perfect age for baseline testing. Brother-in-law eager to participate for compensation. Beginning systematic introduction of Protocol 7. Martin's hands didn't shake as he read. The cold fury that had settled over him since that day in Dr. Goodman's office had crystallized into something diamond-hard and absolutely focused. Charlotte didn't know about Philip yet. Martin had kept that information to himself, knowing she'd be destroyed by the guilt. She already blamed herself for Dawn. Learning that her ex-boyfriend had orchestrated Emma's torture out of jealous revenge might break her completely. Detective Jones had located Philip's current residence, a converted warehouse in an industrial district, but lacked probable cause for a warrant. The evidence from Don's apartment pointed to Master Philip, but couldn't definitively prove Philip Hyde's identity without more concrete connections. We're building the case, Jones had told Martin that morning. Another week, maybe 2, and we'll have enough to move. But Martin had spent 20 years studying criminal psychology. He knew Philip's type. The man was already spooked by Don's arrest. He'd destroy evidence, move locations, possibly harm other children to cover his tracks. 2 weeks was too long. Martin pulled up the full dossier he'd compiled on Philip Hyde. The man had one weakness, his massive ego. He believed he was smarter than everyone else, that his medical knowledge and careful planning made him untouchable. Good. Martin could work with that. He composed a message on one of Master Philip's underground forums, using Morse's access codes. To Master Philip, your protocols are flawed. Protocol 7 shows obvious gaps in methodology. Any real scientist would see it. I have better data from more sophisticated experiments. If you're interested in collaboration, meet me. Otherwise, I'll share my corrections with your buyers and expose your amateur work. It was a gamble. The message would enrage Philip while simultaneously appealing to his narcissism. He'd either ignore it, or he'd have to prove Martin wrong. Morse called back within an hour. Martin, what the hell did you just do? Master Philip is going crazy in the private channels. He's demanding to know who you are, threatening to track you down. Perfect. Tell him I'll meet him in person to prove my credentials. Neutral location, his choice. Tell him I have evidence that Protocol 7 subject was my own test case and that I've achieved better results. He'll know it's you. He'll know it's Emma. That's the point. His ego won't let him resist confronting me. Martin's voice was clinical, detached. He'll want to gloat about what he did. He'll want to prove he's smarter. And when he does, Martin didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. 24 hours later, Philip Hyde agreed to meet. Chapter 4. The Predator's Pride. The abandoned paper mill had been closed for 15 years, its rotting infrastructure a monument to the city's industrial decline. Philip Hyde had chosen it for their meeting. Isolated, no security cameras, multiple escape routes. A predator's perfect hunting ground. Which was exactly why Martin had arrived 6 hours early. You're insane, Detective Jones had said when Martin outlined his plan. We can't protect you in there. If he suspects this is a trap, he won't. I've studied men like Philip my entire career. His narcissism won't let him believe I'm a threat. Martin had laid out the psychological profile. He thinks I'm a distraught father thrashing blindly for revenge. He has no idea I've spent 20 years learning exactly how his mind works. Now, hidden in the mill's upper level, Martin watched Philip arrive through the scope of the camera he'd mounted. The man looked exactly like his photos, mid-30s, well-groomed, with the kind of conventionally handsome face that helped predators blend in. He moved with confidence, clearly believing himself in control of the situation. Martin descended the rusted stairs, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. Philip stood in the center of the building, hands casually in his pockets, smiling like they were old friends meeting for coffee. Martin Hamilton, the famous forensic psychologist. Philip's voice was smooth, educated. I've read your papers. The Narcissistic Offender, Understanding the God Complex in Serial Predators. Quite insightful. I particularly appreciated your analysis of. Cut the flattery, Philip. We both know why we're here. The smile didn't waver, but something flickered in Philip's eyes. Interest. Do we? I thought you wanted to discuss methodology. Compare notes on our respective research. I want to understand why you tortured my daughter. Now the smile widened, becoming something cruel. Tortured? Such an inflammatory word. I prefer observational research. Emma was perfectly safe. The doses were calculated precisely, enough to cause discomfort, never permanent harm. I'm a medical professional, Martin. I would never actually endanger a child. The rationalization was textbook. Martin had heard variations of it hundreds of times from hundreds of offenders. They always believed their own justifications. You did it because Charlotte rejected you. I did it because Charlotte Charlotte Hamilton, needed to understand consequences. Philip's facade cracked slightly, showing the seething resentment beneath. She destroyed my career. Got me expelled with her lies about that patient. Ruined my life because I loved her, and she chose a paper pusher who profiles criminals instead of a man who actually understands medicine. You tampered with that patient's medication. The hospital had proof. I was conducting an experiment, testing drug interactions that could have revolutionized pain management. Philip's voice rose. But Charlotte reported me before I could publish my findings. She was jealous of my potential, so she destroyed me. And then she had the audacity to live a perfect little life. Perfect marriage, perfect career, perfect daughter. So you recruited her drug addict brother to poison Emma and film it. Very creative revenge. Don was pathetically easy to manipulate. A few $1,000s, some cocaine, and he would have sold his own mother. Philip was fully engaged now, unable to resist explaining his brilliance. The beauty of it was Charlotte never suspected. She welcomed me into your home through Don, trusted him with Emma, and I got to watch her precious perfect life slowly unravel. Martin had his phone recording in his jacket pocket. Every word, every admission. But he needed more. Needed Philip to implicate the entire network. Needed him to provide evidence that would bury him and everyone involved. You said you weren't working alone. Who else is in your network? Philip laughed. You think I'm stupid enough to give you names? Please. I agreed to meet you because I wanted to see your face when you realized how powerless you are. The police can't touch me. Don's testimony won't hold up. Convicted drug addict with a grudge against his brother-in-law? No physical evidence tying me to anything? Your daughter's too young to testify credibly, and even if she wasn't, her memories are too corrupted by the sedatives. Then why are you here at all? Because I wanted you to know it was me. Philip stepped closer, his face triumphant. I wanted Charlotte to know, eventually, that every time she looks at Emma, she'll remember this was her fault, that her choices destroyed her daughter's innocence. That's the real experiment, Martin, not the physical pain, but the psychological torture of knowing you couldn't protect your child from the monster your wife created. Martin's expression never changed. You're right about one thing. Charlotte did create a monster, but not the one you think. Philip frowned. What? The lights died. Philip spun, suddenly realizing he was trapped. You spent so much time studying Emma. Martin's voice came from the darkness, now amplified through the speakers Morris had helped him install. But you forgot to study me. 20 years of analyzing predators. 20 years of understanding how men like you think. You're predictable, Philip. You're a cliché. Emergency lights flickered on. Not the building's original fixtures, but ones Martin had positioned specifically. Philip was illuminated in the center like a stage performer. Around him, projected on the walls from hidden projectors, were images, chat logs, bank transfers, the ledger from Don's apartment, photographs of Philip meeting with other network members, and footage, dozens of children suffering, while Philip's voice narrated the protocols like he was presenting at a medical conference. What did you do? Philip's voice cracked. I trapped you. Every admission you just made is recorded. Every member of your network you've mentioned in your messages, all documented. And in about 30 seconds, this building is going to be surrounded by FBI agents. You can't. This is illegal. Entrapment. Any lawyer will. I'm not a cop, Philip. I'm a forensic psychologist. And when those FBI agents arrive, they're not coming because of anything I said or did. They're coming because an anonymous tip led them to discover extensive evidence of a child exploitation network operating from this location. Evidence that you, in your arrogance, never bothered to move. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the building. Philip's face went from triumphant to terrified in seconds. You planted evidence. I didn't plant anything. I just made sure the evidence you already had was easy to find. Martin emerged from the shadows, his expression cold. You were right about one thing. Don's testimony won't hold up. Good thing I don't need it. The doors burst open. FBI agents in tactical gear flooded the building, weapons drawn. Detective Jones entered behind them, his expression grim with satisfaction. Philip Hyde, you're under arrest for conspiracy to exploit minors, distribution of child abuse materials, and a very long list of other charges that should keep you in federal prison for the rest of your life. As agents cuffed Philip, he stared at Martin with pure hatred. This isn't over. My lawyers will find their client has already been convicted in the court that matters most. Martin gestured to the projections. Social media works fast, Philip. About 5 minutes ago, all of this evidence hit every major news outlet, every true crime forum, every parent advocacy group. Your face, your name, your crimes, it's everywhere. Even if you somehow beat the charges in court, you'll never escape what you are. Everyone will know. Philip's face went white. The realization of what Martin had done, the perfect revenge, settled over him like a shroud. You've destroyed me. No, Martin said quietly. You destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone could see it. Chapter 5, Collateral Damage. The FBI raid on the paper mill uncovered more than anyone expected. Hidden in Philip's secured laptop were files on 18 children across 4 states, detailed protocols for pain research, and a network of 12 active participants including doctors, teachers, and 2 daycare workers. Within 48 hours, federal agents had arrested 7 people. 4 more were in custody internationally. Don Horton, already in jail, had his bail revoked when investigators found additional evidence in his storage unit. Charlotte sat across from Martin in their living room, her face hollowed by grief and guilt. Emma was still with her grandparents, and would be for at least another week while the media circus died down. "I should have known," Charlotte whispered for the 100th time. "When Philip contacted Don 6 months ago, offering him consulting work, I should have questioned it. You didn't know Philip was even alive. The restraining order was from 5 years ago. But Don, I convinced you to let him stay with us. I told you he was getting better, that he deserved another chance. I brought the monster into our home." Her voice broke. "Emma's trauma is my fault." Martin moved to sit beside her, taking her hands. "Philip orchestrated this. He manipulated Don. He exploited your compassion. None of this is your fault. Then why do I feel like I killed our daughter? She's not dead, Charlotte. She's alive. She's resilient. She'll heal. Will she?" Charlotte's nurse training made her clinical even through tears. 6 months of systematic poisoning. The psychological impact of the sedatives, the pain, the betrayal by someone she trusted. Martin, I've seen what that does to children. The PTSD, the anxiety disorders, the attachment issues. And I've spent 2 decades studying trauma recovery. We'll get her the best therapists. We'll surround her with love and safety. We'll help her heal." Charlotte looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the arrest. "You're different. Since that day in the hospital. You've been so controlled, so focused. I've been falling apart, and you've been doing what needed to be done. How are you not destroyed by this?" Martin was quiet for a long moment. "Because I learned a long time ago that the only way to survive looking into the abyss is to have something to anchor you. You and Emma are my anchor. If I let myself break, I can't protect you. So I didn't break. You trapped him. Philip, the news is saying you set up an elaborate sting operation. I made him trap himself. The FBI is investigating whether you crossed any legal lines. They won't find anything actionable. I was careful." Martin's voice was matter-of-fact. "Philip confessed to everything voluntarily, on his own recording device that I didn't know he had. The FBI found evidence in a location they were anonymously tipped to investigate. Nothing I did was technically illegal. Technically. Charlotte, I need you to understand something. Philip Hyde was never going to stop. The network he built would have continued destroying children for years. The legal system is slow, and he would have found ways to slip through. I did what needed to be done to protect Emma and every other child in his files." Charlotte stared at him, and Martin saw the moment she chose to accept it. Not forgive, not necessarily approve, but accept. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." But not everyone was willing to let it go. Detective Jones called Martin 3 days later, his voice tense. "We have a problem. Philip's lawyer is Lawrence Crane, the Lawrence Crane." Martin knew the name. Every prosecutor in the state did. Lawrence Crane was the defense attorney who'd gotten 3 serial killers acquitted on technicalities, who destroyed careers of investigators with accusations of misconduct, who charged $50,000 an hour and earned every penny. He's claiming entrapment, illegal surveillance, prosecutorial misconduct, everything. And he's good enough that it might work. Philip confessed to me voluntarily. In a private conversation that you recorded without his consent in a location you specifically lured him to. Crane is arguing that even though Philip came voluntarily, your entire setup was designed to circumvent his rights. Jones sighed. The federal prosecutor is getting nervous. If this case falls apart, it won't. Martin, you need to listen. Crane is going after you specifically. He's painting you as a vigilante who contaminated the investigation. If the judge agrees, everything Philip said in that mill gets thrown out, and without his confession. Then we use everything else. The evidence from his laptop is circumstantial without the confession to tie it directly to him. Don's testimony is compromised. The chat logs can be dismissed as fabricated. Crane is very, very good at creating reasonable doubt. Martin was quiet, thinking. Philip had made a mistake, one born of arrogance and rage. He'd confessed because he couldn't resist gloating. But Martin had made a mistake too. He'd been so focused on getting the confession, on making Philip face his crimes, that he'd potentially compromise the legal case. What do you need from me? The prosecutor wants you to testify about Philip's psychological profile. Establish motive, state of mind, pattern of behavior. But Crane will tear you apart on the stand. You're personally involved. You orchestrated the confrontation. You have every reason to lie. I've testified in dozens of cases. I can handle cross-examination. Not like this. This time you're not the expert witness. You're the victim's father with a vendetta. Everything Crane needs to destroy your credibility is right there in your actions. Martin understood. In his effort to protect Emma and stop Philip, he'd potentially become the weak point in the prosecution. There has to be another way. There is, Jones said quietly. If we can find one of the other victims. Someone old enough to testify, someone whose case doesn't involve you, someone whose trauma is documented and whose testimony can establish the pattern. Then we don't need Philip's confession to you. We build the case without it. How long will that take? Weeks, maybe months. And Crane is pushing for bail. Philip cannot make bail. The prosecutor is arguing flight risk, danger to community, but with Crane involved. Jones trailed off. I'm sorry, Martin. You did everything right from an investigative standpoint. But legally, we're in trouble. After hanging up, Martin sat in his office, staring at the wall. He'd been so focused on catching Philip, on making him confess, on destroying him completely, that he'd forgotten the most important thing, making sure the bastard never walked free. His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Hamilton? A young woman's voice, nervous. My name is Shannon Drew. I saw the news about Philip Hyde, about what he did to your daughter. And I think he did it to me too. When I was 8. Martin's blood ran cold. How long ago? 10 years. I'm 18 now. I've been in therapy for years because of the nightmares, the anxiety. My parents never understood what happened. The doctors said it was just a sensitive stomach, stress from school. But I remember the juice boxes. I remember the man who gave them to me, my piano teacher. And when I saw Philip Hyde's photo on the news, that was my piano teacher. That was him. Martin's mind raced. A victim old enough to testify, with documented medical records and therapeutic history. Someone whose case predated Emma's, establishing pattern of behavior. Shannon, I need you to call Detective Israel Jones immediately. He gave her the number. Tell him everything. Don't leave anything out. Can you do that? Will it help? Will it put him away? Yes, Martin said with absolute certainty. Yes, it will. Chapter 6. The Network Unravels. Shannon Drew's testimony changed everything. Within a week, her medical records from a decade ago showed the same pattern of mysterious gastrointestinal issues that had plagued Emma. Her therapist's notes documented trauma consistent with systemic abuse. And she'd been taking piano lessons from a man named Dr. Philip Hayes, an alias Philip Hyde, had used before his expulsion from nursing school. But more importantly, Shannon had something Emma didn't, a mother who'd taken photographs. Annie Griffin Drew had documented everything about her daughter's mysterious illness, including photos of the suspicious juice boxes her piano teacher had given Shannon as rewards. The manufacturer's date codes on the boxes matched purchases traced to one of Philip's old credit cards. Lawrence Crane tried to discredit Shannon, to paint her as an opportunist seeking publicity. But he'd miscalculated. Shannon Drew wasn't a traumatized 6-year-old or a desperate drug addict. She was an 18-year-old pre-med student with perfect recall, unshakable composure, and a quiet rage that impressed even the most jaded courtroom observers. He called them magic juice, Shannon testified, her voice steady. He said they would help me become a better piano player, that they were vitamins that great musicians used. I trusted him. I was 8 years old, and I trusted him. And what happened after you drank them? I would get very sick. Stomach cramps so bad I'd curl up on the floor. He would document everything. How long the pain lasted, how severe it was. He took photographs of my face while I was crying. He told me it was part of the treatment, that I needed to push through the pain to get stronger. Shannon's voice cracked slightly. I believed him. I thought it was my fault I wasn't strong enough. The jury was transfixed. Even Crane couldn't shake her testimony. But Shannon's case opened another door. The FBI's investigation into Philip's financial records had traced payments to a pharmaceutical consultant, Dr. Lance Marks, a researcher who'd been fired from 3 different universities for ethics violations involving human testing. Marks had supplied Philip with the specialized compounds used in the protocols, substances designed to cause pain without leaving obvious physical evidence. He's our way into the rest of the network, Jones told Martin as they reviewed the evidence. Marks is facing federal charges, and he's already negotiating. He's giving us names, locations, everything. The whole operation is collapsing. Martin studied the files Jones had shown him. 12 arrests so far. 8 more pending. Lives destroyed, careers ended, families torn apart. But justice being served. What about the children? 19 identified victims so far. All getting medical and psychological care. The FBI has victim services coordinating with local authorities in each state. Jones looked at Martin carefully. Emma's case is the most recent and severe. The prosecutor wants to use her medical records as evidence of Philip's escalating pattern. But we won't need Emma to testify. Relief flooded through Martin. Thank God. Shannon's testimony, combined with Marks's cooperation and the digital evidence, is enough. The prosecutor is confident. Jones paused. You did good, Martin. Even if the methods were unconventional. Am I under investigation? The FBI looked into your actions. Technically, you didn't break any laws, at least none they can prove. Recording conversations where you're a participant is legal in this state. Meeting Philip in a public location and allowing him to confess voluntarily doesn't constitute entrapment. And any evidence you might have anonymously directed us toward is still legally obtained once we had probable cause. Jones's expression was carefully neutral. You walked a very fine line, but you stayed on the right side of it. Barely. Martin nodded. He'd known the risks. What happens now? Philip Hyde goes to trial in 6 weeks. With Shannon's testimony, Marks's cooperation, and the mountain of evidence, the prosecutor expects a guilty verdict on all charges. Philip's looking at 40 years minimum, likely life. Good. The other network members are taking plea deals. They're all facing significant prison time. Don Horton's lawyer is arguing for leniency since he cooperated and was manipulated. But given his direct role in Emma's case, he's still looking at 15 to 20 years. Martin thought about that. Don, who'd sold out his own niece for drug money and a few $1,000s, who'd administered poisons to a 6-year-old child and filmed her suffering. 15 to 20 years didn't feel like enough. But it would have to be. Charlotte wants to testify at the sentencing hearing, Jones continued. She wants Philip to hear what he did to her family. I think it would be good for her. Closure, processing, all that psychology stuff you understand better than me. I'll talk to her. After Jones left, Martin sat alone in his office. The past 6 weeks had been a whirlwind of investigation, revelation, and justice. But throughout it all, he'd maintained his clinical distance, his controlled focus. Now, with the end in sight, the walls he'd built started to crack. He pulled out his phone and looked at a photo from Emma's 6th birthday, 2 months before Don had moved in, before Philip had begun his protocols. Emma was laughing, covered in cake frosting, absolutely radiant with childhood joy. Would she ever laugh like that again? Dr. Goodman had referred them to specialists, trauma therapists who worked specifically with children who'd experienced systematic abuse. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic. Emma was young enough that with proper support, she could heal. The physical damage was reversible. The psychological scars might fade with time and therapy. But Martin knew what the statistics said. He'd studied enough cases to understand that childhood trauma echoed through entire lives. Emma might struggle with anxiety, trust issues, attachment problems. She might need therapy for years, possibly decades. Philip Hyde had stolen more than 6 months of Emma's life. He'd stolen her innocence, her sense of safety, her ability to trust that the adults around her wouldn't hurt her. And for that, 40 years in prison, even life, didn't feel like enough. Martin's phone buzzed. A message from Charlotte. Emma wants to come home. Her therapist thinks she's ready. Can we bring her home tomorrow? Martin stared at the message, feeling something crack inside his chest. The controlled, clinical distance he'd maintained for weeks suddenly shattered. And for the first time since that day in Dr. Goodman's office, Martin Hamilton broke down and cried. Chapter 7. The Testimony. The courtroom was packed for Philip Hyde's trial. Media filled the back rows, sketch artists positioned for the best angles, and a mob of protesters outside held signs demanding the death penalty. Even though this was a federal case where capital punishment wasn't on the table. Martin sat in the gallery next to Charlotte, both of them dressed in dark, conservative clothing. Emma was at home with her grandparents, protected from the spectacle. Her therapist had been adamant. Emma was healing, but exposing her to the trial would set back months of progress. Philip Hyde entered in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive lawyer by his side. The arrogant, smirking man from the paper mill was gone. Prison had aged him. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. Lawrence Crane had clearly advised him to look remorseful, vulnerable. But when Philip's gaze swept the courtroom and locked onto Martin, just for a second, the mask slipped. Pure hatred burned in those eyes. Martin stared back, unflinching. "You lost," the look said. "You destroyed yourself, and now everyone sees exactly what you are." Shannon Drew took the stand first. Over 3 hours, she methodically detailed her abuse 10 years ago. The juice boxes, the treatments, the photographs, the pain. Her testimony was devastating in its clinical precision. She never cried, never faltered, never let Crane shake her story. "Miss Drew," Crane asked during cross-examination, his voice dripping with condescension, "isn't it true that you've discussed a book deal about your experiences?" "My agent approached me," Shannon replied calmly. "I haven't made any decisions about that yet. But the potential financial gain from my client's conviction is nowhere near enough to compensate for what he did to me." Shannon's voice turned to ice. "No amount of money will give me back the years I spent in therapy, the nightmares, the trust issues, the fear. If Mr. Hyde is convicted, it's because he's guilty, not because I have a book deal." The jury loved her. Crane knew it. He wrapped up his cross-examination quickly. Dr. Lance Marks testified next, detailing how he'd supplied Philip with specialized compounds, research chemicals that existed in legal gray areas, designed to cause suffering without leaving obvious traces. His testimony implicated the entire network, explaining how Philip had built a sophisticated operation around documenting children's pain for an audience of wealthy sadists. "Did you know the substances were being used on children?" the prosecutor asked. Marks, looking like he'd aged 20 years, nodded slowly. "I knew. Philip told me it was for behavioral research, studying pain responses. He paid me $50,000 per shipment. His voice broke. "I knew what he was doing, and I did it anyway. I'll regret it for the rest of my life." "Why did you agree to testify?" "Because seeing the photos of those children, seeing what my chemicals did, I couldn't live with myself anymore. I wanted to help put Philip and everyone like him away forever." The prosecution spent 3 days systematically destroying any possible defense. They presented the digital evidence, chat logs where Philip discussed his experiments, financial records showing payments to network members, the videos Don had filmed of Emma's suffering. That was the hardest moment. Charlotte had to leave the courtroom when the prosecutor showed the jury-selected footage, carefully edited to avoid being exploitative, but showing enough to establish Emma's systematic abuse. Martin forced himself to watch, forced himself to remember why they were here. Philip's defense was essentially that he'd been conducting legitimate research into pain management, that his methods had been misunderstood, that he'd never intended harm. It was a desperate argument that fell apart under scrutiny. Charlotte testified on day 4. She stood in the witness box, her nurse's uniform traded for a simple black dress, and detailed what Philip's research had done to her family. "My daughter trusted her uncle," Charlotte said, her voice shaking but clear. "She loved him, and he poisoned her while we slept under the same roof. She woke up screaming in pain, and we had no idea why. Do you understand what that's like? Watching your child suffer and not being able to help. And when you learned it was your brother? I wanted to die. I blamed myself for bringing Don into our home, for trusting him. But then we learned about Philip." Charlotte's eyes found him in the courtroom. This wasn't about science or research. This was revenge. Philip wanted to hurt me by hurting my daughter. He wanted to destroy my family because I wouldn't be with him 12 years ago. That's not research. That's evil. Crane tried to discredit her, suggesting she was emotionally compromised, that her testimony was colored by grief and anger. But Charlotte stood firm, her years as an ICU nurse giving her a composure that couldn't be shaken. Martin didn't testify. The prosecutor had decided his personal involvement made him a liability, and Martin agreed. His role had been to catch Philip, not to convict him. The evidence and testimony would do that. On day 7, the jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all charges. Philip Hyde showed no emotion as the verdict was read, But Martin saw his hands clench on the defense table. Lawrence Crane immediately filed notice of appeal, but everyone knew it was over. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony unshakable. 40 years minimum, the judge said. Sentencing would be in 3 weeks. Outside the courthouse, Martin and Charlotte faced a barrage of news cameras. Martin made a brief statement. Justice was served today, not just for our daughter, but for every child Philip Hyde and his network harmed. We're grateful to the FBI, the prosecutors, and especially to Shannon Drew for her courage in testifying. Now our family can begin to heal. They didn't take questions. They walked through the crowd to their car, Charlotte gripping Martin's hand so tightly it hurt. Is it really over? She whispered as they drove away. Not yet, Martin said. One more thing to finish. Chapter 8, The Final Blow. 3 weeks later, Martin sat alone in the courtroom for Philip Hyde's sentencing hearing. Charlotte had opted to stay home with Emma, not wanting to see Philip's face ever again. But Martin needed to be there, needed to see it through to the end. The judge had allocated time for victim impact statements. Shannon Drew went first, followed by the parents of other victims. Each testimony was heartbreaking. Childhood stolen, innocence destroyed, families shattered. Then it was Martin's turn. He approached the podium, a single page of notes in his hand. But he didn't look at them. He looked directly at Philip Hyde. Your Honor, my name is Dr. Martin Hamilton. I'm a forensic psychologist, and for 20 years I've studied men like Philip Hyde. I've interviewed serial killers, analyzed mass murderers, profiled the most violent offenders our society produces. Martin's voice was calm, clinical. And in all that time, I've never encountered anyone quite as pathetic as the man sitting at that table. Philip's head snapped up, rage flickering across his face. Philip wants us to believe he's a brilliant researcher, a misunderstood genius pursuing important scientific questions. But the truth is simpler and more pathetic. He's a failed nursing student who couldn't accept rejection. When Charlotte Lara chose someone else, when his career ended because of his own incompetence and cruelty, Philip couldn't handle it. So he spent 12 years nursing his wounded ego, building a fantasy where he was the victim and everyone else was wrong. Martin glanced at his notes, then continued. The network Philip built wasn't about research or science. It was about power, about controlling the vulnerable and profiting from cruelty, about convincing himself that he was special, superior, beyond normal moral boundaries. But he wasn't special. He was just another narcissistic predator with delusions of grandeur. The pain Philip inflicted on my daughter, on Shannon Drew, on 18 other children we know of, that wasn't research. It was revenge dressed up in pseudo-medical language. It was a grown man throwing a 12-year-long temper tantrum because a woman didn't want him. Martin's voice hardened. My daughter is 6 years old. She's in therapy 3 times a week. She has nightmares about the juice boxes her uncle gave her. She flinches when anyone she doesn't know tries to touch her. She'll carry these scars for the rest of her life because Philip Hyde couldn't handle being told no. But here's what Philip doesn't understand. Emma will heal. She has a family who loves her, therapists helping her process her trauma, and every resource we can provide to ensure she grows up strong and safe. Philip took 6 months of her life. He won't take any more. Martin leaned forward slightly. Meanwhile, Philip will spend the next 40 years, possibly the rest of his life, in federal prison. No more control. No more power. No more opportunities to hurt children. Just decades of knowing that his entire elaborate revenge plot accomplished nothing except destroying his own life. That's real justice. Not because we took revenge, not because we hurt him, but because we removed his power and made him face the consequences of his choices. Philip Hyde is irrelevant now. He's just another inmate, another forgotten predator rotting in a cell. And that's exactly what he deserves. Martin stepped back from the podium. Thank you, Your Honor. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Then the judge nodded and made notes on his legal pad. Lawrence Crane stood for his client's final statement. Your Honor, Mr. Hyde maintains his innocence and will be filing extensive appeals. We request the minimum sentence given the... Mr. Crane, the judge interrupted, his voice sharp. I've reviewed this case extensively. The evidence is overwhelming. The testimony is credible. And frankly, in 30 years on the bench, I've rarely encountered such a calculated, systematic pattern of child abuse. The judge looked at Philip. Mr. Hyde, you violated the trust of families, exploited vulnerable children, and showed no remorse whatsoever. You treated human suffering as entertainment and profit. The law allows me to sentence you to 40 years. I'm giving you 50. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor looked surprised. 50 years was more than they'd requested. Additionally, I'm recommending you be housed in a maximum security facility with no possibility of early release. I'm ordering lifetime registration as a sex offender and prohibiting you from any contact with minors for the rest of your natural life. If, by some miracle, you ever see freedom again, it will be as a broken old man with nothing and no one. The judge's gavel fell. Court adjourned. Philip was led away in chains, his face ashen. He didn't look at Martin. Didn't look at anyone. The arrogant predator was gone, replaced by a man who'd finally realized the magnitude of his destruction, of others, but mostly of himself. Outside, Martin called Charlotte. 50 years. Maximum security. He'll die in prison. Charlotte's sob of relief came through the phone. Is it really over? Yes, Martin said, feeling the tension he'd carried for months finally release. Yes, it's finally over. Chapter 9, Aftermath. 6 months later, Emma Hamilton celebrated her 7th birthday with a party in their backyard. The guest list was small, family and a few close friends from her new school, carefully vetted. Randy and Stephanie Hayden manned the grill, while Charlotte supervised the cake decorating station Emma had insisted on. Martin watched from the porch as Emma laughed with her friend Misty Hawkins, both girls covered in frosting. The sound of his daughter's genuine laughter was something he'd wondered if he'd ever hear again. She's doing better. Dr. Teresa Jackson, now Emma's primary care physician, stood beside him with a glass of lemonade. Her last checkup showed complete physical recovery. The psychological healing will take longer, but her therapist is optimistic. She still has nightmares, less frequently than before, and she's learning coping mechanisms. Emma's resilient, Martin. She's going to be okay. Martin nodded, wanting to believe it. Emma would never forget what happened. The trauma would always be part of her story, but it wouldn't define her entire life. They'd make sure of that. Detective Jones arrived fashionably late, bringing a wrapped present. Sorry I missed the cake cutting. Paperwork on the Hyde Network cases. More arrests. Last 2 network members were extradited from Canada. That's everyone. Jones watched Emma playing. 19 children getting help now. 8 families started a support group. Shannon Drew's running it. She's studying psychology now, wants to work with trauma victims. She'll be good at it. The Bureau wants to hire her as a consultant when she graduates. She's got a unique perspective. Jones glanced at Martin. They want to hire you too, specifically for cases involving child exploitation networks. Your insight into how these predators operate could be valuable. Martin considered that. I'll think about it. No pressure. But you did something important, Martin. Yeah, it was unconventional. Yeah, you pushed some boundaries. But you stopped a network that had been operating for years. You saved kids the FBI didn't even know were in danger. I did what any father would do. No, Jones said quietly. Most fathers would have broken, would have done something stupid that made everything worse. You stayed focused. You used your training. You caught a monster and made sure he'd never hurt anyone again. That takes a special kind of strength. Charlotte joined them, slipping her hand into Martin's. Emma wants you to judge the cake decorating contest. There's a contest? There is now. She and Misty have been plotting. Martin followed Charlotte to where Emma stood with her creation, a lopsided cake covered in rainbow frosting and approximately 1 million sprinkles. Daddy, look. It's a unicorn. Well, it's supposed to be a unicorn. Misty says it looks like a horse with a horn, but that's what unicorns are, so I think I won. Martin pretended to consider seriously. The sprinkle distribution is excellent. The color theory is bold. And the structural integrity is, well, it's leaning, but we'll call that artistic intent. I declare this the winner. Emma cheered, then threw her arms around Martin's waist. Love you, Daddy. Love you too, sweet pea. For a moment, Martin let himself imagine an alternate timeline where none of this had happened, where Philip Hyde had never contacted Don Horton, where Emma's 6th birthday had been followed by a normal, happy year, where they'd never learned what monsters lived in the shadows. But that wasn't their timeline. This was the one where evil had touched their family, where innocence had been stolen, where they'd all been changed irrevocably. But also the timeline where they'd fought back, where justice had been served, where they'd proven stronger than the darkness. What are you thinking about? Charlotte asked quietly as they watched Emma play. That we survived. That she's going to be okay. That we're going to be okay. Charlotte leaned against him. You saved her. You saved all of them. We saved her. Together. No, Martin. I fell apart. You held everything together. You caught him. You made sure he couldn't hurt anyone ever again. Charlotte looked up at him. I don't know if I ever properly thank you for that. You don't need to thank me for protecting our daughter. I do, though. Because you didn't just protect her. You protected me. You protected 19 other children. You stopped a nightmare. Charlotte's voice wavered. I've been angry at myself for 6 months. Angry that I didn't see it. Angry that I brought Dawn into our home. Angry that I ever dated Philip in the first place. But watching you, seeing how you channeled that anger into something productive, something that actually fixed the problem, I'm in awe of you. Martin pulled her close. I was terrified the entire time. Terrified I'd make a mistake, that Philip would escape, that the legal case would fall apart. I wasn't some action hero. I was a desperate father who got lucky. You were a forensic psychologist who used 20 years of training to outsmart a predator. Don't diminish what you did. Emma called them over for the piñata. As Martin watched his daughter laughing with her friends, surrounded by family, safe and healing, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt since that day in Dr. Goodman's office. Hope. The road ahead would be long. Emma would need years of therapy. Charlotte was still processing her guilt. Martin himself had nightmares about what might have happened if they discovered the abuse even a day later. But they were moving forward. Together. Stronger than the darkness that had tried to destroy them. And somewhere in a maximum security prison, Philip Hyde would spend the next 50 years knowing he'd failed. That his elaborate revenge had accomplished nothing except his own destruction. That Emma Hamilton would grow up, heal, and live a full life while he rotted in a cell. That was justice. Not perfect, not complete, but real. And it was enough. Epilogue. 3 years later, Martin received an email from Shannon Drew, now a senior psychology major with multiple graduate school offers. Attached was a photo. Shannon standing with 15 teenagers, other survivors of the Hyde network, now older, healing, forming bonds over shared trauma. We call ourselves Phoenix, Shannon wrote. Rising from the ashes. We're starting a nonprofit to help other survivors and advocate for stronger child protection laws. Thought you'd want to know that the people Philip Hyde tried to break are now the ones helping others heal. He failed. We won. Thank you for making sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. Martin showed the email to Emma, now 9 years old and thriving in 4th grade. She'd just gotten first place in her school's science fair for a project about medical ethics. Are those the other kids that man hurt? Emma asked, looking at the photo. Yes. They're helping people now. Emma studied the image carefully. Good. Bad people shouldn't win. They don't, sweet pea. Not in the end. Because of people like you? Because of people like Shannon. Like you. Like everyone who refuses to let the bad people define them. Emma nodded sagely, then returned to her homework. Martin watched her, marveling at her resilience. The nightmares had stopped months ago. Her therapist had recently suggested they could cut back sessions to monthly rather than weekly. Emma would always carry the scars. But they wouldn't stop her from living fully, from being brilliant and kind and strong. And that, Martin thought, was the real victory. Not revenge, not destruction, but survival, healing, and the refusal to let evil have the last word. Charlotte found him in his office that evening, staring at Shannon's email. Still processing. Still grateful, Martin replied. 3 years ago, I thought I knew what justice looked like. Convictions, sentences, punishment. But seeing those kids thriving, helping others, turning their trauma into purpose, that's real justice. You gave them that opportunity. By stopping Philip, you gave them the chance to heal and grow. Martin pulled Charlotte close. We gave them that. You kept Emma together when I was hunting Philip. You held our family together. You're as much a hero in this story as anyone. Charlotte kissed him. We're a good team. The best. Downstairs, Emma called out. Mom. Dad. Can we have movie night? I want to watch something with happy endings. They looked at each other and laughed. Because that was exactly what they'd earned. Happy endings, ordinary moments. A life that moved beyond the darkness into light. Coming, sweet pea. Martin called. Let's find something with lots of happy endings. As they headed downstairs to join their daughter, Martin glanced back at his office, at the files from the Hyde case, the commendations from the FBI, the letters from other survivors' families. Then he closed the door. That chapter was over. This chapter, the one where his family healed, grew stronger, and built a future that Philip Hyde could never touch. This was the chapter that mattered now. And it was just beginning. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.